My earliest memories are painted in shades of fear and shame, a tapestry woven from the threads of his anger. The sound of his belt snapping against the air was as familiar to me as the chirping of birds outside my bedroom window. I can still feel the sting of its leather, the sharp slap of his hand across my face when my grades didn't meet his impossibly high standards. "You'll never be good enough," he'd sneer, his voice dripping with disdain. And in those moments, I believed him. There wasn't a day in that house when I wasn't on edge. I would walk into a room cautiously, listening for the faint sounds of his presence, his heavy footsteps, the creak of his chair, the jingle of his keys. Every noise was a signal, a warning to measure my movements and words. Anything could set him off. A plate left on the counter, a sock on the floor, the tone of my "good morning." My mother wasn't much better. She wasn't cruel, but her silence hurt just as much. She would avert her eyes when he yelled at me, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she were the one enduring the scolding. Her hands, always busy folding laundry or chopping vegetables, trembled when his temper flared. I used to beg her for protection with my eyes, hoping for a word or a gesture to shield me. But she offered nothing. She had given up long before I ever realized it, resigned to her role as a spectator in his tyranny. I didn't just grow up under his roof. I grew up under his shadow. His presence loomed over every aspect of my life, shaping the way I thought, the way I felt, the way I carried myself. Even when he wasn't there, his voice echoed in my head. At school, I tried to blend into the background, terrified that my teachers or classmates might see the bruises on my arms or hear the fear in my voice. I avoided making friends, worried that someone might ask to come over or call the house and accidentally expose me. My teachers praised me for being quiet, obedient, disciplined. If only they knew. The worst nights were the ones when I thought he might be proud of me, when I brought home a decent report card or won a small award. I'd hand him the paper, my heart racing with a foolish hope that he might smile or say, "Good job." Instead, he would find a flaw, a missed point, a lower-than-perfect grade. "This is the best you can do," he'd say, shaking his head in disgust. Those nights always ended with me in tears, vowing to do better next time, though deep down, I knew nothing would ever satisfy him. By the time I was a teenager, the fear had hardened into something else. Resentment, bitterness. I stopped trying to win his approval and focused all my energy on surviving until the day I could leave. I got my first job at 16, working late shifts at a local diner. I told myself it was for the money, but really it was for the escape. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and grease, but it was a sanctuary compared to home. The other staff didn't ask questions about the dark circles under my eyes or the cuts on my hands. They didn't care why I worked so hard or why I never wanted to go home. I spent as much time there as I could, sometimes volunteering for extra shifts just to delay the inevitable walk back to his domain. The diner became my refuge, a place where I could breathe without the weight of his judgment pressing down on me. And then, at 18, I left for good. I packed my things in the middle of the night, leaving behind a hastily written note on the kitchen table. I didn't care if he read it or ripped it to shreds. I didn't even care if he tried to come after me. I was done. But leaving wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. For years, I thought I could bury my past, shove it into a box and seal it shut. But the scars he left weren't just physical. They were carved into the deepest parts of me. They shaped the way I saw the world, the way I interacted with people, the way I viewed myself. Even as I built a new life, his voice lingered in my mind. Every time I doubted myself, every time I hesitated or second-guessed a decision, I could hear him whispering, "You'll never be good enough." He was wrong. I knew that, but knowing it and believing it were two very different things. And it would take years before I finally began to understand just how much damage he had done, and just how deeply his shadow had seeped into my soul. Leaving home at 18 was less of a choice and more of a necessity. By the time I graduated high school, every interaction with my father felt like a ticking time bomb. His anger had become so routine, so predictable, that the moments of calm were more unnerving than his outbursts. I spent those last months in a constant state of tension, waiting for the next explosion. When I finally packed my bags for college, I didn't tell him goodbye. I didn't tell him anything. My acceptance letter was my escape route, and I wasn't about to waste it. My mother cried as I loaded my things into the car, but even her tears felt muted, as though she'd known this moment was inevitable. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "Take care of yourself." Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop me from leaving. College felt like stepping into a different world. For the first time, I wasn't walking on eggshells. I could laugh without fear, speak without second-guessing myself. But freedom came with its own challenges. The scars of my upbringing clung to me, invisible yet ever-present. I couldn't shake the feeling that every misstep would lead to punishment, that every small failure would reveal me as the worthless person my father had always told me I was. I threw myself into my studies, determined to prove him wrong, even if he'd never know. Medicine had always fascinated me, and now it became my obsession. Every late-night study session, every grueling exam, every moment of exhaustion felt like a small victory over the man who had tried to break me. Still, the past had a way of creeping in. My father's voice echoed in my mind during moments of doubt. "You'll never make it. You'll fail just like I said you would." I carried that voice with me, even as I worked to drown it out with achievements. It was during one of those rare moments when I allowed myself to call home that everything changed. My relationship with my mother had been distant since I left. She called occasionally, her voice filled with longing and guilt, but our conversations were surface level. This time, though, her tone was different, hesitant, almost afraid. "Mom?" I prompted after several long pauses. "Is something wrong?" She sighed, and when she spoke, her voice was trembling. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Her words spilled out slowly, each one heavier than the last. "He's not your real father." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. The sentence didn't make sense, didn't fit into the narrative of my life. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She hesitated again, then explained. Years before I was born, she'd had an affair, a brief, fleeting connection with a man she described as kind, charming, and ultimately unreachable. She never saw him again after she became pregnant, and when she told my father the truth, he had agreed to raise me as his own. But somewhere along the way, that arrangement had turned sour. Maybe it was resentment. Maybe it was regret. Whatever the reason, the man who was supposed to protect me had instead become my tormentor. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought if he believed you were his, it would be enough." "Enough for what?" I snapped, anger rising in my chest. "Enough to make him stop? Enough to justify everything he did to me?" "I'm sorry," she said, but the words felt hollow. Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry didn't erase years of pain, didn't change the fact that my entire life had been built on a lie. I ended the call without saying goodbye, my hands shaking as I set the phone down. The truth felt like a freight train barreling through my mind, shattering everything in its path. He wasn't my father. He never had been. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of relief and rage. Relief because his words, his actions, his cruelty, they weren't a reflection of me. But the rage was stronger. All those years, I had suffered under his shadow, believing I was the problem, believing I deserved it. And for what? To protect a fragile facade that had never been real in the first place? The revelation didn't bring closure. It brought questions, doubts, and a fresh wave of pain. Who was my real father? Did he even know I existed? And if he did, would he have been any better? For the first time in years, I thought about my father, the man who raised me, who shaped my childhood in the worst possible way. He wasn't my blood, but he had left an indelible mark on my soul, and I wasn't sure if I would ever escape it. The call with my mother marked a turning point in my life. Whatever tenuous connection I'd felt to the man I called Dad was severed in an instant. The anger and bitterness I'd carried for years felt sharper now, but it came with a strange sense of liberation. I no longer owed him anything. Not my thoughts, not my time, not the burden of his memory. He wasn't my father. I threw myself in a medical school with a single-minded determination. It became my sanctuary, a space where the chaos of my childhood couldn't touch me. Every day was a challenge, demanding more of me than I thought I could give. But for the first time, I wasn't working to prove myself to anyone else. This was for me. The long nights of studying, the endless hours in labs, the grueling rotations. They were exhausting, but they were mine. I was shaping a version of myself that had nothing to do with him. Each patient I treated, each diagnosis I made, was a small act of defiance against the man who had tried to convince me I'd never amount to anything. In medicine, I found a kind of clarity that I'd never known before. The precision, the structure, the purpose, it was the antithesis of the chaos I'd grown up with. I learned to compartmentalize my emotions, to focus on facts and solutions rather than dwelling on the past. Slowly, I began to rebuild myself, piece by piece. I made friends, real friends, not the superficial acquaintances I'd clung to in my younger years. They didn't pry into my past, and I didn't offer much, but they gave me a sense of belonging that I'd never had before. By the time I finished my residency, I had a job I loved, a small but supportive circle of people in my life, and a quiet peace I'd never thought was possible. I'd built a life that was entirely my own, untethered from the shadows of my childhood. I didn't think about him. I didn't let myself think about him. In my mind, he was part of a closed chapter, a dark, suffocating period that I had locked away in a box and buried deep. Occasionally, my mother would call, and I'd hear her mention his name in passing. But I never asked about him. I didn't want to know how he was doing, whether he'd changed, whether he regretted anything. For me, he no longer existed. But the truth was, I hadn't escaped him as completely as I'd wanted to believe. His voice still lingered in the back of my mind, whispering doubts in moments of weakness. His shadow still hung over my relationships, making it hard to fully trust anyone, to let anyone in. And no matter how hard I tried to forget him, the scars he'd left on me refused to fade. I could silence his voice for weeks, months even, but every now and then, in the quiet moments, it would creep back in, reminding me that he was still there, buried but not gone. I didn't realize just how much of him I still carried with me, how much of my life was shaped by his absence as much as his presence, until the night he came back into my life in the most unexpected and shattering way. It was late, the kind of shift where minutes blurred into hours, and the sharp sting of coffee did little to combat the exhaustion creeping into my bones. The ER was a storm of activity, as it always was. Patients shuffled in and out, the air filled with the beeping of monitors and the low hum of controlled chaos. I moved between rooms, checking charts, giving instructions, and doing my best to stay ahead of the wave. The ambulance sirens outside barely registered. They were background noise, as constant and predictable as the heartbeat of the hospital. But when the gurney rolled through the doors, something shifted. Severe trauma. One of the paramedics called out, his voice steady despite the urgency. Male, late 50s. Multiple fractures, probable internal bleeding. BP is dropping. He's unstable. I stepped forward, ready to assess the patient, my exhaustion momentarily replaced by muscle memory. But as I glanced at the man on the gurney, my breath caught in my throat. It took a moment for my brain to process what I was seeing. The man before me was gone, his face pale and streaked with blood. Time and circumstance had stripped away the strength and intimidation I'd once associated with him. But there was no mistaking him. It was him, my father. For a moment, I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my hands frozen at my sides. Memories I had buried deep clawed their way to the surface, a relentless flood of anger and pain. I saw his face, twisted with rage, towering over me as a child. I heard his voice, sharp and venomous, hurling insults that cut deeper than any physical blow. I remembered the nights I cried myself to sleep, my mother's hollow eyes staring at the wall, the suffocating fear that defined my childhood. And now here he was, vulnerable, broken. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow, as I approached the gurney. His eyes were closed, his face slack with unconsciousness. Tom had not been kind to him. The once imposing man I had feared so much was now frail, his skin lined with wrinkles, his hair thinning and streaked with gray. "Doctor," one of the nurses prompted, her tone snapping me out of my trance. I nodded, my voice tight. "Get him into trauma too. We need imaging and lab stat. Start fluids, he's crashing." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. I moved mechanically, my training taking over as we worked to stabilize him. He had multiple fractures, ribs, femur, clavicle, and his scans revealed internal bleeding that required immediate intervention. But while my hands were steady, my mind was a storm. Every time I touched him, every time I gave an order or checked a monitor, the weight of who he was pressed down on me. This was the man who had shaped my childhood in the worst possible way, the man whose anger had left scars I still carried. And now his life was in my hands. I couldn't decide if it was justice, irony, or some cruel twist of fate. As we prepped him for surgery, I caught myself staring at his face again. It was strange seeing him like this, so small, so helpless. The anger I had carried for years bubbled to the surface, but beneath it was something else, something I couldn't quite name. I didn't have time to sort through my emotions. He was critical, and my job was to save him. But as I scrubbed in, my hands trembling ever so slightly, one thought echoed in my mind. What kind of person am I if I let him die? And, more hauntingly, what kind of person am I if I save him? The operating room was a controlled storm, the kind I'd navigated countless times before. Machines beeped in steady rhythms. The nurses and techs moved with practiced precision, and the sterile air was heavy with the gravity of the moment. But tonight, the familiar setting felt foreign, like I didn't belong here, like I was intruding on someone else's life. Vitals are stabilizing, but he's not out of the woods, a nurse said, her voice calm but firm. I nodded, forcing myself to focus. My hands moved automatically, the tools of my trade, extensions of my body. But inside, my mind was anything but steady. There he was, lying on the table, exposed and vulnerable in a way I had never imagined. The man who had towered over me as a child, whose voice had filled every corner of my world with fear, was now broken. And I was the one tasked with putting him back together. Dr. Carter? The nurse's voice snapped me out of my daze. She handed me a clamp, her eyes briefly meeting mine. We're losing blood pressure. We need to move now. I swallowed hard and stepped into the role I knew so well. Training kicked in, overriding the turmoil in my mind. My hands were steady as I worked to stop the bleeding, my voice calm as I directed the team. But the storm inside me raged on. Anger clawed at the edges of my focus, memories flashing in my mind with every beat of the monitors. His voice, sharp and cruel, echoed in my ears. You'll never be good enough. The phantom sting of his belt across my back, the hollow ache of nights spent wondering why I wasn't enough to make him proud. And then, beneath the anger, something more insidious. Guilt. What kind of person would I be if I let him die? The question lingered, unspoken but heavy. I hated him. I hated what he'd done to me, what he'd taken from me. But standing there, watching his blood pool beneath him, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision that wasn't mine to make. Or was it? The hours stretched on, each moment feeling both eternal and fleeting. I closed my eyes for half a second, a brief reprieve from the intensity, and saw my younger self, a child cowering in the corner, shielding himself from the brunt of his father's anger. That boy whispered to me now, his voice raw with pain. Why are you saving him? I didn't have an answer. I worked because it was what I knew how to do. I worked because walking away wasn't an option. But with every stitch, every cut, every move to stabilize him, the question gnawed at me. When the bleeding finally stopped and his vitals leveled out, I stepped back, my breath heavy behind my mask. The room was quieter now, the chaos subsiding as the team began cleaning up. We've done all we can, I said, my voice strained. Let's monitor him and get him to recovery. I peeled off my gloves and walked out of the room, each step heavier than the last. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel triumph. All I felt was the weight of the past pressing down on me, sharper and heavier than ever before. As I stood in the hallway, staring at the double doors that separated me from him, the storm in my chest threatened to break free. What kind of person would I be if I let him die? What kind of person would I be if I saved him? Neither answer felt right. And neither answer could silence the child inside me who still wanted, against all logic, against all reason, for this man to look me in the eye and say the words I had needed to hear my entire life. But deep down, I knew he never would. The operating room was a place of precision, but tonight it felt like a battlefield. As I stitched his wounds and set his fractures, I couldn't escape the presence of someone who shouldn't have been there, my younger self. He stood in the corner of my mind, small and fragile, watching me with wide, tear-streaked eyes. He wasn't screaming or yelling. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words could. His gaze followed every movement of my hands, every careful suture and measured decision. Why are you saving him? The boy seemed to ask. Why does he deserve this? I felt the weight of those questions in every fiber of my being. My father's face, pale, broken, vulnerable, lay inches from mine. How many times had I been in a similar position, though reversed? How many times had I begged him, silently or aloud, to stop, to soften, to see me as a child who needed love instead of a target for his rage? The boy in my mind whispered to me now, his voice raw with the kind of pain only a child can feel. Let him go. Let him hurt like he hurt us. But I couldn't. I wasn't that boy anymore. Or was I? I stitched another wound, my hand steady, but my mind a whirlwind of conflict. Medicine was supposed to be about healing, about saving lives. I had dedicated my entire adult life to the principle that every life was worth something, that every patient deserved my best effort. And yet, as I worked to repair the damage to this man's body, I couldn't ignore the part of me that wanted to stop, to step back, to let fate take over and finish what the accident had started. It wasn't just anger or bitterness fueling those thoughts. It was the ache of a child who had spent years begging for his father's love and receiving nothing but pain in return. The surgical team moved around me, their voices a low hum, their movements efficient and practiced. To them, this was just another trauma case, another life to save. But to me, it was so much more. This was the man who had shaped my life in the worst ways, who had left scars on my soul that I still hadn't fully healed. And yet, here I was saving him. When the final suture was in place and the monitors showed steady vitals, I stepped back and let out a long, shaky breath. The surgery was a success, medically speaking. His life was no longer in danger. But as I stripped off my gloves and peeled away my gown, I felt no relief, no triumph, only a sickening emptiness. I walked out of the operating room, leaving the bright lights and the hum of machines behind me. My colleagues offered quiet nods of acknowledgement, but I barely noticed them. My legs carried me down the hall to a quiet corner where I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving as though I'd just run a marathon. The voice of my younger self still echoed in my ears, faint but persistent. Why did you save him? He didn't deserve it. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure I ever would. The next morning, I stood outside his hospital room, staring at the chart clipped to the door. His name was there in bold letters, as if the universe needed to remind me of the weight I had carried into that operating room. I told myself I was here to check on a patient. Nothing more, but deep down, I knew the truth. I needed to face him, to see what saving his life had actually meant. When I walked in, the first thing that struck me was how small he looked. The man who had loomed so large in my childhood, who had filled every room with his anger and presence, was now a frail figure propped up in a hospital bed. His face was pale, his body wrapped in bandages, and tubes snaked across his arms, feeding him fluids and medications. He was drifting in and out of consciousness when I entered, his eyes glassy and unfocused. For a moment, I thought he might not wake at all, and part of me felt relieved. But then his eyes flickered open, scanning the room slowly until they landed on me. At first, there was no recognition in his gaze. He stared at me like I was just another doctor, another nameless figure in a white coat. I wondered if the years had erased me from his mind, if I had become as inconsequential to him as I'd once feared. But then, something shifted. His brow furrowed, and his lips parted slightly, as though he were trying to piece together a puzzle. Slowly, the cloudiness in his eyes gave way to clarity. "Why are you here?" he croaked, his voice weak and raspy. I stared at him, my emotions warring between anger and detachment. "I saved your life," I said, my voice flat and matter-of-fact. I didn't know what I expected in return, maybe a flicker of gratitude, maybe even an apology, but his reaction was nothing like that. His face twisted into something I couldn't quite read. Confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. He didn't thank me. He didn't ask how I'd done it. He just stared at me like he couldn't understand why I'd bothered. For a moment, the silence in the room was deafening. I felt a flicker of something. Was it pity? Disgust? As I watched him struggle to sit up, his body too weak to move more than an inch. His hand twitched slightly, like he wanted to gesture, but couldn't summon the strength. "Why?" he asked again, his voice softer this time, almost vulnerable. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Why had I saved him? Because it was my job? Because I couldn't let myself sink to his level? Because, deep down, I still wanted something from him, even if I didn't know what it was? Instead, I said nothing. I stood there, staring at the man who had shaped my life in the worst ways, and wondered if he even cared. He closed his eyes, his body sinking back into the bed, as though the conversation had exhausted him. I stayed for a few moments longer, waiting for something, anything that might give me clarity. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the machines and the sound of his labored breathing. I turned and left the room, my chest heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. In the days following the surgery, I found myself returning to his room more often than I cared to admit. Each time, I told myself it was for medical reasons, checking on his vitals, monitoring his recovery, but deep down I knew better. There was a knot in my chest, one that tightened every time I thought about him, and I couldn't seem to untangle it without confronting him directly. The conversation started awkwardly, with the kind of sterile small talk that fills the void when two people don't know how to address the elephant in the room. I'd ask about his pain levels, and he'd mutter something about feeling fine. He'd thank the nurses, but never me. And yet, I kept coming back, hoping for something more. Finally, one afternoon, I couldn't hold back any longer. As I stood by his bed, watching him fiddle with the edge of his blanket, I blurted out, "Do you even realize what you put me through?" He looked up at me, startled, his face a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice hoarse but still carrying that edge of dismissiveness I remembered so well. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "The beatings, the screaming, the constant reminder that I was never good enough. Did you even think about what that did to me?" For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he let out a soft, tired sigh. "I did my best," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "You weren't an easy kid." The laugh that escaped my lips was bitter, almost venomous. "Your best," I repeated, my voice rising. "Beating a child was your best? Calling me worthless? Telling me I'd never amount to anything? That's what you call doing your best?" His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place, guilt, maybe, or frustration, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, as if the view outside held answers he couldn't give. The silence between us stretched, thick and suffocating. I wanted to shake him, to force him to admit that he'd been wrong, that he'd failed me in every way that mattered. But as I watched him lying there, frail and diminished, the anger I'd carried for so long began to mix with something else. Pity. He wasn't the towering, intimidating figure I remembered from my childhood. He was just an old man, broken and alone. And yet, the scars he'd left on me were still raw, still bleeding. "You don't even care, do you?" I said finally, my voice quieter now, but no less pained. "You don't care what you did to me. You never did." He didn't answer. And in that moment, I realized that the closure I was searching for might never come. Some wounds are too deep to be healed by apologies, or the lack of them. I left the room that day with more questions than answers, and the knot in my chest felt tighter than ever. Forgiveness had always been a word I'd scoffed at when it came to him. It felt impossible, like trying to rebuild a house from ash. For years, I had carried my anger like armor, letting it protect me from the wounds he'd left behind. But now, as I stood on the precipice of his mortality, I found myself wrestling with something I never thought I'd face: the possibility of letting go. I told myself forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. I'd heard that line 100 times, from self-help books, therapists, and well-meaning friends. But every time I thought about forgiving him, a voice inside me rebelled. Did he deserve it? Could I really let go of the years of pain he had caused with nothing more than a whispered apology? Or worse, no apology at all? Yet, every time I saw him, lying frail and quiet in that hospital bed, the image of the monster I had built in my mind began to crumble. He wasn't the same man anymore. His shoulders no longer held the weight of intimidation. His voice no longer carried the edge of fury. He was just broken, and maybe in some ways he always had been. But that realization didn't erase what he'd done. The bruises had faded long ago, but the scars on my soul were still raw, still bleeding. Every interaction we'd had in my childhood had shaped the person I'd become, for better or worse. The fear, the self-doubt, the relentless need to prove myself. They were all his legacy, etched into me as deeply as the beat of my heart. How could I forgive him for that? How could I forgive the man who had turned my home into a battlefield, who had made me feel like a failure before I even understood what success was? And yet, as I watched him struggle to lift a glass of water to his lips, I couldn't deny the pity that stirred in me. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't untouchable. He was human, just like me. Maybe that was the cruelest truth of all. I sat by his bedside one afternoon, the question of forgiveness gnawing at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. He was asleep, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths, the faint hum of the monitors filling the room. "Why did you do it?" I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me. Why was I never enough? The silence that followed was deafening, and I realized I wasn't sure if I even wanted an answer. Maybe it wouldn't matter. Maybe it wouldn't change anything. Forgiving him felt like surrender, like letting him off the hook for everything he'd done. But holding on to my anger felt just as heavy, a chain I couldn't seem to break. I wasn't sure what was worse, the idea of forgiving him, or the idea that I never would. The weight of that decision pressed down on me, and for the first time in years, I felt truly lost. The day of his discharge came quietly, almost anticlimactically. There were no words of thanks, no heartfelt apologies, no grand gestures of reconciliation. He packed what little he had, a plastic bag holding his clothes, a cane the nurses had given him to steady his unsteady steps, and shuffled toward the door without a backward glance. I didn't say goodbye. I stood near the nurse's station, watching as he hobbled down the hallway, his shoulders slumped with age and weakness. His body looked as frail as his spirit, as though life had finally worn him down. I wondered if he felt relief, knowing he was leaving the hospital. I wondered if he even cared that I was the one who had saved him. For a moment, I thought about calling out to him, about saying something, anything, that might bring a sense of closure to this endless, tangled story. But the words caught in my throat. What would I even say? As the doors slid shut behind him, I waited for the feeling of freedom to wash over me. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, convinced it would feel like breaking chains or exhaling after holding my breath for years. But as the seconds ticked by, all I felt was emptiness. Closure was supposed to be clean, definitive, but this wasn't closure. This was a lingering ache, a question without an answer. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the events in my mind, dissecting every moment, every decision. Had I done the right thing by saving him? Would letting him go have been justice? Karma catching up to a man who had caused so much harm? Or was sparing his life an act of defiance? Proof that I had risen above the darkness he'd tried to drown me in? I couldn't decide. To this day, I'm still not sure. There are nights when I lie awake, wondering if I let him leave without saying goodbye, because I didn't care, or because I cared too much. There are moments when I convince myself that saving him was the right choice, that it was proof of my strength, my growth. But there are just as many moments when I feel like I failed the child I used to be, the boy who would have given anything to see his father suffer as he had. What I do know is this: his shadow still lingers. It's not as oppressive as it once was, but it's there, in the corners of my mind, in the quiet moments when I think I've finally escaped him. Maybe I'll never fully escape him. Maybe that's the price of the scars he left behind. The truth is, I'll never know if saving him was the right thing to do. And maybe that's something I'll have to carry with me for the rest of my life.